Alright, let's continue on our journey through the cell here as we start basically from the outside of the cell with the plasma membrane of the cell. Essentially, all cells have a plasma membrane of some sort, and all of those plasma membranes are essentially made up of the same thing, which is a phospholipid bilayer. And so, to get down to what that is, let's talk a little bit about why it is a phospholipid bilayer. So, the phospho part comes from this end of the molecule. If you right here, if you look right there, that is what we call a phosphate. Okay, in chemistry. And so that is the phospho part of the phospholipid. Now, if you remember from the macromolecule stuff that we talked about, that lipids essentially are fats, and so the fat end of the molecule is this end down here. Now, all of this stuff is pretty important because what this means, let me clean this up a little bit for us. What this means for us and why this is so important is that this molecule has a really peculiar character because at this end, down where the lipid end is, we have a nonpolar molecule, and down at the other end, we have a polar molecule. Now, if you remember anything from chemistry or from what we've already talked about this year in biology, polar molecules in general like water, okay? And nonpolar molecules in general don't like water. And that's pretty easy to think about because nonpolar, think of oils and fats and stuff like that, like grease. They're not going to dissolve in water very well. In fact, they tend to beat up and sort of float at the top of it. And polar things, take something like, say, salt or vinegar, which of course is mostly water, but those are polar types of molecules, and they dissolve very easily in water. They like water a lot. They're attracted to it. And so what this means is that in a phospholipid is that we've got two ends to it. We've got one end that likes water, okay, and one end that avoids water. Now, these have some technical scientific names. We would say that this end is hydrophilic and this end is hydrophobic. But essentially that's what it means, is that this end is attracted to water, this end tries to avoid water at all costs. Okay, so that is a phospholipid molecule. Now, what happens is pretty interesting is when you put phospholipids in, what happens very interestingly is when you put phospholipids into water, they're going to do some pretty cool things. So they are essentially going to arrange themselves into these weird little patterns here. Now, what you'll see here is that what's happened is that imagine that water is on the outside. Okay, so essentially what we've got here is that the outside of all of this is water. Okay, and so what the phospholipid molecules are doing is that they're trying to arrange themselves in such a way so that only the outside, only one end is approaching the water. Now, what end is that? Well, of course, that is the phosphate end because the phosphate end, remember, likes water, and the lipid end of the molecule detests water, or wants to stay away from water. And so they arrange themselves so that the fat ends, okay, and all in here, okay, those are the lipid ends, okay, all the little yellow parts or orange parts here. Those are the lipid part of the molecule. They are going to basically arrange themselves in such a way so that they're not touching water at all. And this is going to form a barrier where the phosphate end of the molecule is on one end and then the lipid end is stuck down in the middle. Now, this is pretty important for us because this bilayer sheet here, this essentially is what every cell membrane is made up of. And in fact, if you look at this little liposome part here, this essentially is sort of an idea of what a cell is that you've got a membrane on the outside here, and then you've got a pocket of stuff on the inside. And that essentially is what a cell is going to get set up to look like. There's a special term for this idea that phospholipids have two sides to them. They're called amphipathic, which means that they have one end basically that likes water and one end that dislikes water, and so they arrange themselves in this weird. So let's look then at one of these phospholipid bilayers. Now, you see down here at the bottom it says that this is what's called the fluid mosaic model. Now, what that means basically is that all of these phospholipids here, they're not like arranged so that they're like really in a solid sort of state, okay? They're in a fluid state, which means that they can flow around a little bit. Sometimes you get the example of like if you've ever bobbed for apples at Halloween and maybe you've got a bunch of apples and they're sort of all sitting up on the surface of the water. And so they have some room that they can move around each other. That's kind of the way the phospholipids are. Now they're still pretty tightly packed together, so they're not having gaping holes except for the stuff that you see here in the molecule. But they can move around a little bit, and that's the fluid mosaic model. Remember, mosaics basically are like glass pieces that are all sort of stuck together in these weird ways to form patterns, and that's sort of what's going on with all of this extra stuff. So if you look at this, all of the sort of red, orange, sort of lollipop-looking things there, those are the phospholipids, okay, we've talked about. Phosphate ends to the outside, okay, and then lipid ends to the inside. Now, if you pay attention to the labels here, the outside, that's extracellular fluid, so that means that's the outside of the cell, and then that means that this side is the inside of the cell, that's the cytoplasm. And so you've got the vast bulk of your membrane then is going to be those phospholipids. But if you look at this, there's a whole lot of extra stuff in here. So we've got some pretty cool stuff here. We've got these little sort of hexagonal looking things here. Those are cholesterol molecules. You can see that we've got some sugar molecules stuck in here, some carbohydrates. You can see that we've got a protein channel, which we're going to talk about here in a second, is pretty important. And then there's all kinds of proteins that are sort of stuck here for different reasons all throughout that membrane. So what is the purpose of the membrane? Well, it's twofold. It is basically there to be a selective membrane, meaning that it's going to keep some stuff out and let some stuff in. So how does it do that? Well, essentially a lot of things it's going to allow in by simple diffusion. Okay, so really small molecules, and particularly really small non-polar molecules, okay, so non-polar and small, can get through the membrane by diffusion. So what's an example of a couple of molecules that happens to? So CO2 and O2 are good examples. So for instance, if this is our lipid membrane, we want O2 to go through and we want CO2 to go back out. Okay, our cells want oxygen for all the energy processes that we'll be talking about in the coming weeks, and they want to get rid of CO2 as a waste product, okay, and so they want those things to happen. Now, how does that actually happen? What happens through a physical process called diffusion, okay, and basically diffusion just says that if you have a large concentration of something in one area and a low concentration in the other area, so like in the outside of the cell, let's say we have a lot of oxygen, and the inside we don't have much, that if the molecules are small enough, they're going to diffuse through what we call a semi-permeable membrane. Okay, and that's exactly what the cell is. It's semi-permeable, meaning that it's permeable. Permeable means that stuff can get through it. And so semi-permeable means that it allows some stuff through. And basically what that means is the small non-polar molecules can get through. So from high concentration to low concentration, and the point of diffusion is that it wants to equalize things out. And so if you look at this last stage here, this would be like after the diffusion occurred, in that we have basically the same number of, say, O2 molecules on the outside as we do on the inside. That worked out pretty well because at the beginning there we didn't have any oxygen, and then at the end we have some oxygen. That's what our cells need. And it would work the opposite way as well. If we flipped the whole thing over to get rid of the CO2, that would happen. Now, the problem is, of course, is that not everything is small and non-polar. A lot of things aren't. In fact, water is one of those things that it doesn't work that way for. Water is very polar, so it doesn't get through the molecule very well. And all of the foodstuffs and ions and stuff like that the cell needs can't diffuse through that lipid bilayer on their own. So how do they do it? Well, essentially they do it through these things called protein channels. This is what we call assisted diffusion or activated diffusion, sometimes it'll be called. And the way that works is that you've got these protein channels here that are going to help to channel through all of those extra molecules. So you've got a channel there that maybe, say, lets water through. You've got some carrier proteins that can grab a hold of certain molecules, and then they can open up on the other end there to let them through into the cell. You'll notice that it works almost like an airlock would, that it doesn't just open up a channel so that everything can go through. It opens up, allows the right molecule in, and then that triggers it to open up on the other side and allow that molecule out on the other side. It's not just a straight through channel that it only allows certain things through. And the protein channels, they're of a certain size that they only allow certain things through into the cell. So you got stuff on the outside of the cell here, stuff on the inside of the cell here, and it's going to take some way, it's going to need some sort of energy to get that stuff through those cells. And so you've got two basic ways of transport. So you've got passive transport in the case of simple diffusion, and then you've got active transport where there's actually energy required to help to get things through that membrane. Okay, so that's the basics of the phospholipid membrane or the cell membrane. What things do you need to remember about it? I mean, obviously go back and look at your notes on this, but remember that it's made of phospholipids, that phospholipids are polar and nonpolar ends, that's going to form a bilayer for us, okay? And that bilayer are based by the fluid Mosaic model, that some things can get through by diffusion and that other things cannot, and they have to get through protein channels and carrier proteins and stuff like that.